How, Karthik, in your view, should a tech leader prepare for this? Right? I mean, it's a big decision.
Code churn is a cause for concern, and what is code churn? Right? So you start to sort of tailor it to the pain points that most developers feel and say, hey, for me. So I think that made a big difference, and it helped a lot with the change management and the human angle there because reducing it this way helped us a lot.
And this person wants to try this out, and he wants to now pitch to their CTO or to their head of AI to actually do this. What would you think, and how should they pitch this?
Copilot is not replacing my developers. It is only making them.
Welcome to the Neural Talks, your gateway to the forefront of AI innovation. I'm your host, Ranjith Melarkode, and together we'll explore the AI revolution with the brightest minds pushing boundaries and shaping the future. Through candid conversations, they share hard-won insights as we unlock the transformative power of AI. Get informed, get inspired. This is the future, and you're in the front row. Welcome to another episode of the Neural Talks, and this one is on unlocking productivity in technology organizations using Copilot, and we have the best person on board for this. Karthik, thank you again for joining us. Really, really exciting to have you here, and look forward to our talk.
Thanks for having me, Ranjith. It's a pleasure to be on, as always. I've been CTO at Zalora first, and then GFG for a total of 13 years. Engineering, product, security, and data are under my remit. As a digital native, we've always been at the cutting edge of emerging tech, and the application of AI is no different.
Super, very succinct. And so, Karthik, Copilot. So, when you first look at Copilot, Karthik, we want to sort of zoom back and take a step back. What was the real vision for Copilot, and why was Copilot relevant for consideration, in the context of business in which you guys were?
Great question, Ranjith. See, I think for me, the context is around the industry that we're in. It's online fashion retail is challenging. And post-COVID, offline sales surged, and of course, eating into online growth. Fast fashion rivals dominate with high volume, low margin, unsustainable products. I don't have to name them, but it's pretty obvious. And there's increasing competitive pressure on the rest of us. As it's always the case in tech, despite these challenges, technology remains our edge, and it's important for us to drive continued investment in growth. Now, the challenge here is, adding more staff is not really an option when there's cost pressure. So instead of adding staff, which leads to process complexities, diminishing returns, the famous IBM book on mythical man-month and all of that, we experimented with Copilot very early as a smart pair programmer to boost our engineers' productivity.
Oh, perfect. So, it's really like a killer app. A use case for AI is what I'm sensing from what you're saying, at least in your org, to actually unlock productivity gains. So great. I mean, so from a tech perspective, this is fantastic. So from an organization leadership's perspective, was there any skepticism in how people viewed Copilot? Were they aware of this? Or was this like a green flag right from the start, and you should just it was just a easy rollout for you?
That's a great question. I think first of all, I believe CTOs and VPs of engineering, heads of engineering need to have the autonomy and the trust of management to take this call of whether or not to roll out Copilots. Of course, the guardrails of security, not leaking our intellectual property, checking on the legality of using an off-the-shelf code suggestion tool, etc. aside, I think this is a tech leader's call. So the change management was mostly within the tech team rather than outside. And maybe later I can unpack a bit what leaders can do also outside of tech organizations. I think my engineering leaders were very enthusiastic to embrace this from the get-go. And to be fair, the non-engineering management and my peers in management and upper management was also very positive to see us as early adopters. And when you look at sort of late 2022, when there's a lot of hype around LLMs and ChatGPT coming out and having this smart assistant, we had substantial support in saying, hey, let's experiment and play with this.
No, this is great. I mean, so from a digital native perspective, I think the road has a different view. So gonna sort of just for a minute request your viewpoint on a pitch book, right? In the sense that for a different kind of organization, if there's a SVP or VP, or a head of engineering, and this person wants to try this out, and he wants to now pitch to their CTO or to their head of AI to actually do this. What would you think that person should actually pitch, and how should they pitch this?
That's a great question. I think the first thing I would say is it's very hard to compete for tech talent in this day and age. It's very hard to retain tech talent over a period of time. I think engineers in general are really positive about these tools and the impact on their individual productivity and their individual happiness and the roles that they're in. And I think there's about 2 years of data that's been collected, right? So from the launch of Copilot in late 2022 to today, we're past the 2-year mark. So it's very hard to sort of push back and say, we're not really sure what the impact is going to be. It's pretty obvious that the impact is positive. So I think that's the first sort of call out to, I would say, senior management that has to take this call. I think secondly, it's a reversible investment in the sense that it lends itself to measured experimentation, where you can say, okay, let me take I think there's a very famous phrase called "you fire bullets, not cannonballs," right? Where you say these are small experiments. If they don't go well, we can reverse them. And the cost of these experiments is also not very much. It's one rule of thumb that I use is, I have teams based in Singapore, so it's a good metric that I think about. To give an entire engineering team of, say, 500 engineers access to GitHub Copilot, and it's priced in dollars, right? So it's the cost of one mid or senior level software engineer in Singapore for full year. So 100,000 Sing dollars roughly buys you Copilot for 500 developers. And if you look at it that way, it's very powerful. You're adding one headcount, but that one headcount can support 500 people all in parallel without emotions, without bottleneck on time, without working out restrictions or whatever. And from that perspective, you're also not making a 2-year commitment or 3-year commitment or investment. It's a monthly pay-as-you-go service. So you turn it on, you set clear metrics, you have guardrails around measurable results. And if the results are not met, you can always disable the tool for specific people that are not using it. I think the risk of not doing it is the risk of being left behind, because within a matter of months, most of the world of software engineering will be using this. And developers tend to gravitate towards companies that give them the best tools. And so it will very soon become a talent retention challenge, and I would push on that dimension as well.
No, fantastic. I really hope the product and the engineering leaders are listening to this. So what you mentioned is, number one, cost benefit analysis. Number two, it's a reversible switch. And number three, what you basically said is this is something that's actually not on day zero. It's already tech that's actually being rolled out, excitement building, and many other teams are going to be using this. So if you're not using this as an advantage, soon many other people are, and you're going to be left behind. Perfect. So great points. So now that we've actually sort of, crossed that, decision, how, Karthik, in your view, should a tech leader prepare for this, right? I mean, it's a big decision. I mean, depending on whether you start small or or whether you're running a small team or a large team, how should a tech leader prepare for this rollout? What should they actually think about in their heads before they actually just go ahead and take the next step?
Sure. Maybe I'll jump straight into the action. From my perspective, I would start with one squad or one engineering team, where a squad is typically 5 to 7 engineers and not more than that. And it's important for the engineering manager of the squad to be enthusiastic about trying the tool. I mean, if they have a reason to not want to use it, or if they're not really supportive, it's not the best squad to experiment with. And they can be sort of late adopters, or they can come along later in the journey. Someone who's really enthusiastic to try it, and teams that are ready to be sold on it, those are the teams that I'd pick. 1 or 2 squads to start with. I think the second thing is it's really important to agree on the metrics upfront and measure them. And some of the metrics that we looked at, for example, are lines of code suggested, lines of code accepted, lines of code deleted or refactored, code churn. That is, how frequently do lines of code change? And there's a bit of negative metric, and maybe we can speak about this a bit later. And I would measure these metrics on at least a per sprint basis, right? And that's sort of laying the groundwork even before you start rolling it out, even before you start giving access. And I think the process of defining these metrics should be a bit of a collaborative one, where developers feel listened to. You don't want developers to think that they're cattle and you're throwing a tool at them and you're expecting them to run like 5x faster. That's not the intention here. And the second thing is, again, in sort of good change management practices, I would run developer surveys every month, both qualitative and quantitative questions, seek feedback on what is and is not working. And then based on that, sort of iterate and pivot. Right? I definitely, one thing to not do is to roll it out big bang and say, okay, we're doing company-wide rollout, 500 people from day zero, because you're not allowing the organization to learn and iterate on this. And typically what happens is only 20% of the people will actually use it. If you say big bang and without any support and coaching and guardrails, it won't take adoption. Rather than if you start with a scarce group, everyone else gets excited saying, oh, when can I use it? Because this group seems to be really happy. Right? So that's the approach I would take.
So you're saying start small, have a vision of what success looks like, and agree on it with people. And also through the process, keep in touch with the devs and get surveys going and seek feedback on what's working, what's not working. Great points. But you mentioned something, Karthik, so I'm going to touch on that a little more. The human aspect of this, right? So you're rolling out Copilot, and obviously it's going to be used by developers and maybe by people, the other technical folks in your team. How did they view this? I mean, was there skepticism, or were they all excited about this? What did it look like?
I think in general, I've been lucky with the tech people that I've had on my team. Right. So in hindsight, people are mostly curious. Okay. Some approach it like it's a toy and they want to play with it. And typically learning by playing is a good way for people to buy into something. There were others who were more enthusiastic. For sure, there were the skeptics who were like, oh, I don't think this is going to make a difference. I think for me, what made the difference was my senior directors of engineering were very, very keen to try it. And they did the selling to devs. And I think as part of the selling, we made sure to not oversell the benefits. It was more a case of, hey, this is going to take the grunt work out of your day-to-day, right? Writing boilerplate, writing unit tests, refactoring very old code that you haven't written, like some developer wrote it and that person's not here anymore. So you start to sort of tailor it to the pain points that most developers feel and say, hey, this is an assistant that'll help you. Then you tell us how good this is, right? Rather than sort of top down saying, this is how you need to use it, this is what I expect from you. So I think that made a big difference. And it helped a lot with the change management and the human angle there, because people always want help when they and that in a non-threatening way, I think introducing it this way helped us a lot.
No, those are fantastic points. I mean, in a non-threatening way and bringing the human angle is something that I certainly hope our viewers actually pay attention to as they're actually, considering these programs. So when everybody says Copilot, they only, imagining engineers as being part of this. Should they also talk about, folks like, if they have separate QA teams and testing, should they, be worried about, whether those get access? There's also a technical writing documentation teams that are typically part of software groups. Should they also be included? What's your view on that?
That's a great question. See, I think we suggested to, like I said before, we suggested to some of our engineers to use Copilot to write unit tests before actually writing classes and functions.
Okay.
And like I said, this helped them see this as a productivity tool rather than as a replacement for them. I'll make a point that's unrelated to Copilot, but it's connected to LLMs. Right? And this came later on in our journey. One of the things that we started doing a lot of about a year in was our support teams had LLMs deployed, and then we trained chatbots to use a decade worth of support ticket history, incident reports, customer query knowledge, and all of that. And the promise was to use LLMs to take away grunt work, not just for devs, but also for support teams, for help desk teams, for customer service frontline teams, and all of that. And so it doesn't have to be a Copilot in a sense of GitHub Copilot. It's just a Copilot to help them do their work better that's trained on a static body of knowledge or even a growing body of knowledge. So from that standpoint, it really helped the non-tech teams. I think also another use case, when you say documentation or integration engineers, or even external parties that use our APIs, one interesting use case that we saw work well was you point an LLM at API endpoints, and then you ask it to generate and update documentation, but also generate code stubs in like 5 languages, right? And say, okay, here's a Python stub, here's a Java stub, or a Go stub to facilitate fast integration for B2B systems. And in our industry, it's quite common where you have brand partners or logistics partners that are connected to our systems, whether it is to update inventory or to ship and sort of get package information. So again, the body of users for this wasn't exactly the core dev group using the Copilots. It was more LLMs to facilitate just making them do the jobs faster.
No, this is truly informative and supportive for all your teams, Karthik. I mean, really, you've actually rolled out LLMs and many other kind of support infrastructure for your teams. Honestly, they're lucky to have you. So we covered a bit of the vision. We covered a bit of how you actually set success. We covered a bit of the human factors. And let me come to the tool, right? So we can now come to the choice of tool. I think when we started off, there was only one tool. Now there are many. So how does one approach this in terms of selecting a tool that's best for their enterprise? Because there are varieties of enterprises. I mean, you have healthcare companies and having dev teams that need to be worried about, compliance, privacy, and many other things. You have banking and financial institutions worried about something else. You have hardcore tech and digital natives that are sort of more free, in some sense. So how does one go about this?
Great question. I think maybe I'll start with our case and then probably speak to the other examples that you mentioned. So in our case, I wanted the fastest time to value. And like most digital natives, we use a cloud-based version control, GitHub. And with GitHub, it's very easy to bolt on Copilot. Of course, they made it very easy to do that. Considering that it's powered by OpenAI and both GitHub and OpenAI are Microsoft owned or backed, it was simpler for us to integrate the use of Copilot into developers' workflows with little to no effort. Speaking of alternatives, right, I think the differences are quite marginal among the LLMs in terms of a code suggestion advantage standpoint. Of course, if you mine Twitter or any of the literature out there, there's of course there are some benchmarks that cloud will do better. There's some benchmarks that O1 will do better. But I think there's less value in analyzing the differences and just more in moving forward quickly. To your point about banks and financial services companies or healthcare companies, as long as customer data is not exposed into these LLMs, I think we're safe. Typically, if you look at a GitHub repository, where does the interface to customer data come from? It's your database queries, whether it's NoSQL database or SQL databases. Again, typically you don't have customer data sitting in GitHub. You only have the application code or the driver code sitting there. So I think whether it's banks or healthcare companies, so long as it's clear that customer data is not being fed into these LLMs or into these tools, it should be quite straightforward. And of course, you can also have walled garden deployments, right, where you basically take a model out of Hugging Face, deploy it into sort of a closed environment in AWS or a closed environment in GCP, and then use that as a plugged-in mechanism to autocomplete. Of course, it's a little bit harder to set it up because your time to value then will be a bit longer. But nevertheless, the options exist if there are riskier environments to consider.
Oh, great. I mean, so those are important points for the customers with more compliance and privacy norms and data security needs. Great. So you've made a tool choice, but typically, as part of your as part of anybody's setup, there are already existing tools for development. There are teams using different sets of tools across different components. So is there an integration play or an ecosystem play that somebody needs to be worried about, or everything just plugs right in?
It's an excellent question. And I think your existing environment in terms of dev environments, the tools that your developers use is an important consideration. Typically, I've noticed that the Copilot VS Code combo is emerging as a very popular ecosystem. And VS Code is also agnostic of whether it's .NET or Python or Java. These days, they've made it kind of the go-to tool like Eclipse used to be when you and I were writing code, right? And then there's the JetBrains ecosystem, which is another sort of popular set of tools, which again can be pointed to use Copilot or Cloud or whatever in the backend. And then you have these sort of built from the ground up AI native dev environments. One example is Cursor.ai. Of course, all of these are viable options for anyone with a Git-like or a GitHub-type development workflow. When it comes to risk and compliance, I think it's important to be very careful here because I would want the comfort that my organization's code and the repositories that we have are not being used for model training purposes. I think it's an important point to make, especially security repositories or proprietary technology that when leaked, it could either erode my competitive advantage or it could constitute a data breach. Sometimes I think the skepticism around using these off-the-shelf LLMs is valid in the sense that, okay, they say they're not using my data for training. Are they really not? And of course, the terms and conditions are a good way to enforce that. Because if they legally say they will not, then you can hold them accountable to that. I don't know if you remember earlier on during the rollout of these copilots, people could go into ChatGPT and then sort of prompt it to then spit out proprietary code. I think it was Samsung, that was the example that comes to mind, but you don't want those problems to happen. My bottom line is I wouldn't trust the code suggestion providers blindly. I'll make sure that my legal department is reviewing terms and conditions carefully before giving me the green flag, and then we hit the on switch.
Okay. So pay more attention and make sure you have the right people also involved and the right departments involved is what you're saying. Great. So crossing over from tools to adoption and scaling, right? How did you pick your first set of teams to try this out? You're literally giving it to some people, but not to others. So, how did that happen?
No, it's a controversial first choice you have to make, right? Because teams are always feeling not being treated, especially if they don't get it. But in our case, we communicated a plan that said, listen, we're going to pilot it with teams that have high feature pressure and low developer count, or teams that are working on refactoring older platforms, or teams that were trying to improve unit test coverage. So it was quite easy to kind of justify that and then say, hey, based on the experiment, we will expand coverage, just wait and, have a bit of anticipation and excitement and delayed gratification playing out there. I think we feel, I personally feel on this very strongly as well, right? Developer productivity is an output metric. So I don't really want to go into this conversation saying I want to optimize your productivity. If developers themselves tell me that their productivity is better, that's a great outcome. I think for me, the bottom line is devs should be willing to try, and they're conscious of low-hanging fruit opportunities, impact opportunities, where you can really justify quick adoption there. So those are things that we look for.
Cool. Once you've chosen a team, for the developers to actually start using this, right, and for them to start getting productive, is there any kind of pre-onboarding that needs to get done, or it's just like roll out and then switch it on and then start?
Not really. So we had our devs watch onboarding videos. I think GitHub came up with a few in the early days, and then we also had some of our senior devs demo people that had done some private testing beforehand, and they ran workshops over a week or two. And then it was just jumping into the deep end of the pool with the tool switched on for this initial squad or two squads that we were working with. I think the important call out here is we were careful to warn the more junior developers to spend time on existing code and improving existing code rather than duplicating or blindly following the AI. And this is, it's more of a philosophical point, but I worry a lot about loss of apprenticeship for junior devs. And, there's a lot of hype around these LLMs today, and people fall, all of us, including myself, we fall for this hype. I think it's important to learn by struggling with tough code. Maybe these are famous last words that people are going to laugh at 2 years later. But I think it's an important step to struggle with difficult code that just doesn't work. Right? You spend hours trying to compile it. It doesn't give you the right output. But your learning process as a junior dev is tied to that struggle. And if you don't do that, then you're just skipping like a big chunk of your learning experience. And if you don't wrestle with difficult problems like this for days, then you're missing out on learning opportunities and hence apprenticeship. So we were cautious to not give this to the most junior developers. And we explained why. Right now, this might seem like an old school reason, but I think it has served us well.
No, those are fantastic points, Karthik. I mean, honestly, it's a counterintuitive choice, honestly, because one of the things that people would naturally do is give it to the least skilled people and say, hey, skill up. But you're right, absolutely right, because there's a big, the right to become or earning the right to become a skilled dev could actually very easily be bypassed and then lost forever, which is a fantastic point. And I don't know if our audiences will agree with this or not, but yes, I mean, this is certainly a fantastic point. So you mentioned about struggles, and since you mentioned about struggles, I'm sure every new rollout is going to come with its own set of nuances and complications. So is there anything as support that needs to sort of be provided across the life cycle of these tool implementations that people should be aware of?
Sure. I mean, we had other than the regular developer surveys that I mentioned, and including the training as part of onboarding new developers, we didn't force it on our developers, especially the senior ones. I think we took the cues from individual preferences here, right? And I feel it's important to trust your devs and their instincts on what works best for them. I mean, I didn't expect everyone to be reporting the same level of impact all the time. For some, it was the go-to tool. For others, they used it selectively for specific use cases. What I would have my EMs do was to check in monthly, and if somebody felt they were not getting much out of it, we just remove the Copilot license and say it's fine. If you don't want to use it, no problem. Right? It's not a dogmatic choice that is like, no, everyone must use it. And I think giving people that flexibility is quite valuable because each individual has his or her own preferences. So we didn't want to kind of do a one-size-fits-all approach. And for me, that was an important sort of support choice we made.
No, this is, again, I think clearly your team is very, very lucky to have you as well. I think so. You're saying value personal preferences, and make sure that you stay with them through those struggles, and then sort of see what you can learn from them. Great. So we're coming to the, to the juicy bits, right? I mean, of this podcast, which is really what are the benefits that you can actually, that you have actually realized, and what's it looking like. So to sort of qualify that question, maybe if you can actually help give us a perspective of a little bit of, where you started, how many people are using this. Maybe that would give a perspective before I actually, go down and ask you more, what are the benefits?
Sure. Most of our engineering team has access to GitHub Copilot. Fast forwarding on from the pilot, so we started with one or two squads in different locations, and then once the metrics started to add up, several hundred developers use it daily across different platforms today. Different technologies, DevOps, and native app development teams. And we went from the first sort of two squad pilot to making it available for whole engineering teams in about 2 quarters. And again, it was a case of choice, right? So people request for it, they get the license, they use it. If they don't find it useful, they switch it off. So again, everyone has the option to use it after about 2 quarters of trials.
Oh, this is pretty cool. I mean, 2 quarters, you've scaled across the entire engineering team of a few hundred is what you're saying. So, question, now that you actually put this to use across, across these large teams that you have, there are typically, greenfield projects, and then there are brownfield projects, right? And then, start something right from scratch, and you actually do this. You develop the entire code base from zero. And then there are these where there's existing code bases, and many companies, sort of want to move these existing products or features from one framework to another, because of cost differences or because of standardization. How does Copilot work across both these? I mean, is it just the same, or is there any difference?
I think it answers it depends. It depends first on the seniority and the capability of the humans, my developers that are handling the Copilot. I think anecdotally, they're more capable at writing boilerplate and what you call Greenfield, right? Where the context is limited rather than, having them refactor a complex application written over many years with several 100,000 lines of code. Because one thing that we must remember, and this doesn't come out very well in the marketing material and the hype, is that a lot of these copilots have a limited context window. So typically, if your application has tens of thousands of lines of code, that's appropriate. If it has millions or several 100,000 lines of code, this is well above the context window for the copilot. And necessarily, the copilot will start duplicating code because it can only look at between 10 and 70,000 lines of code at any one point in time. Maybe cloud can go a little further. But the fundamental technology has limitations on the context window available. So I would say it depends. Typically, Greenfield, to start from zero to have like a working prototype, I think it lends itself very well to that. To have like a complex system and sort of rewriting it or re-architecting it, I don't think it would do so well in those situations, at least relatively speaking.
Fair enough. So coming down to the actual benefits, right? So now for you as, group CTO, what would you say are the top 3, benefits that you've actually realized from Copilot? And if there are intangible benefits apart from these top 3, I mean, could you actually sort of give us a view of those, please?
Sure. I think the first one is increased developer productivity. And what I mean is they're completing tickets between 20 and 30% faster. A result of this is the second benefit, which is it frees up developer time for harder tasks like architecting, systems design decisions. And I think, tangible/intangible side effect is it harmonizes ways of working and internal coding standards, conventions, because you basically have an assistant that's, fairly standard and structured across an entire team. And like back in the day, you're fighting over, oh, you used camelCase, I use some other case. How am I supposed to interoperate between these two class files? You have less of those, right? Because you tend to harmonize the ways of working. So those are the 2 tangible and 1 intangible benefit.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, yes, I mean, people fighting over standards and, unnecessary friction, removing that is, I think, is like a huge benefit. Honestly, that's something pretty unique that's actually come out now. So this is another question that we get, right? For devs and managers, after Copilot, is there something that they don't have to do anymore?
For devs, for sure, writing unit tests. I mean, they don't like doing it. But then with Copilot, they can claim to do it, but it's actually mostly automated. So I think that's a big benefit. Okay. I think on the negative side, again, something that we probably end up doing less of is there's a reduced incentive to do pair programming. And I think this, again, reduces the opportunity for apprenticeship of junior devs with senior devs. I think it's an important part of their development because your junior devs are the supply chain for your future mid and senior devs. Right? So I think having that apprenticeship is really important because once you cut that off, suddenly you'll have this really good senior devs and then junior devs that depend on these AI tools like a crutch forever. So that's a risk, and I worry about the medium to long term impact of this, and will it make people less skilled in the long run? Right?
I mean, true. I mean, having a path through pairing was actually a very, very valuable, position for developers, to actually get. And yes, definitely Copilot does sort of introduce something there. Were you ever in a situation, and this is a controversial question, but definitely, nevertheless, an interesting question for us, where the code quality was poor, it was unsuitable, or the human code was better, and therefore they rejected it, and sort of the code was completely out of context. Were any of those situations ever came up?
I think some of them have. I have seen engineering managers walk up and say that the time needed to review the suggestions and accept the suggestions is actually slowing them down, right? Especially the more established developers who, their flow state is much more established. So they're saying I will use less of Copilot. I think there is one challenge, and this is one of the downsides, and this is also coming up in a lot of independent research, that code churn is a cause for concern. And what is code churn? Right? If a line of code, all things equal, changes once in 6 months without Copilot, and then it changes once in 2 weeks with Copilot, this is really helping to drive better business. And there's podcasts and videos that you can search for where code churn is something that keeps coming up. Just having an AI tool that's suggesting changes doesn't mean it's useful changes. Right? So that's a challenge to be tackled.
Super. Stepping back a bit, when you look at it from the overall implementation perspective, for you, did you find any goals that did not play out, both from a technology and from an organization perspective? And if so, why did they not play out?
Sure, I wouldn't call it a goal, but I think there's a bit of a myth that, especially there's a lot of stuff being shared on the internet that software developer roles are reducing, job posts are coming down, LLMs will completely replace developers. I think as a tech person, I'd definitely like to debunk that. Like, Copilot is not replacing my developers. It is only making them code faster. I think that's the first lesson.
Mark Zuckerberg is definitely not going to be happy, with that statement from you because he just put out something else.
Yes, I totally see that. But I think the ground reality is it is possible to build agentic systems. And, with Mark Zuckerberg's R&D budget, he surely can build like a completely agentic developer. But what I'm seeing is it's not something that, to go back to your question about the human factor, it is not replacing developers for sure. It is more assisting and helping them. And really motivated, strong, computer science oriented, good developers will become much better with these tools. That's for sure. So that's sort of one non-goal that didn't play out. And I think, again, I probably sound like a broken record on this, but I do worry about the impact of having an AI assistant all the time. It's a bit like coding with Stack Overflow all the time. When you Google and then copy paste Stack Overflow stuff, so it's not that much different. It's a really smart, sort of consolidated, intelligent tool that's suggesting. But what is it doing to your learning experience as a developer? And that's an old school concern that for me hasn't played out quite well yet. So.
But nevertheless, very relevant, Karthik. And so what you're saying is essentially don't let it become a crutch because that's something that will actually hamper your careers. What you're telling the devs, if you make it into a crutch, it's not really going to help you actually level up and earn your rights. And obviously the other thing that you're also saying is there is this hype about developers being completely replaced, but we probably have different views on that, is what you're saying. So these are great. Having looked back on this entire implementation over the last few months, what is the advice that you would love to give to other CTOs or other engineering and tech leaders who are just sort of considering this journey and trying to get in there?
Sure. I would say learn by doing and start with small squads and trusted senior devs to pilot usage. I would set success metrics and measure them closely for this small group. I think the important watch point here is that everybody's experience, every organization's experience is going to be unique to the code base, to your talent pool of engineers, to the tooling that you use. And so, if you spend too much time reviewing literature and sort of seeking external feedback, there's only so much value that you're going to get out of it. And I think, jumping into doing and sort of picking up and iterating on that basis would be my main advice to other CTOs and engineering leaders.
No, very, very, very clear points. I really hope people pay attention to these. And looking to the future, for the Global Fashion Group, what do you think are the next steps for Copilots and how you plan to scale it or use this better across the organization?
Great question. I don't plan to give access to GitHub Copilot per se outside the tech teams because I think the value is far too limited. I think what we will end up doing instead is to use a more kind of enterprise-facing, Gemini type of LLM that is able to then build no-code systems, sort of automate workflows, try and build some agentic chain of command type of systems to remove the grunt work, as I said a little bit earlier. And I think applicability of Gen AI into the larger org is a much bigger question. GitHub Copilot outside of engineering, no, that's definitely not on the cards. I mean, from a GitHub Copilot standpoint, I'm really hoping to see the tooling improve, specifically around context windows. I think this is going to require a step change from the model builders to specifically optimize for larger context windows that will help LLMs infer better for larger code bases. Typically a company that's been around for more than 10 years, 15 years is going to have millions of lines of code, not necessarily to achieve complex outcomes, but even the basic stuff might have a lot of CRUD, right? So I think getting more value from these copilots from an engineering standpoint is what I'm hoping to see over the next, the pace of change is so fast and maybe what I say will be obsolete before it's published, but, chances are it'll take us a couple of years before we get to that point, right? So.
No, super. So, Karthik, thank you so much. I think you covered rich experience in this in very, very clear, succinct points, including putting out cautionary notes for junior and mid-level folks that are sort of just looking at this for the first time and how they should shape their career around this, and at the same time touching on very valuable points for engineering and tech leaders. Thank you so much, Karthik. Really a pleasure having you again, and look forward to having you on our next episode very soon.
Thank you, Ranjith. It was a real pleasure to be on and look forward to being back again soon.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Neural Talks. Hit subscribe or follow us on LinkedIn to stay informed of many more great episodes on AI coming up. We're the Neural, where humans meet AI.